This is your host, Rusty the King, with another history video. Today we're going to talk about Alfred Packer. Alfred Packer was known as the Colorado Cannibal. Basically, he would kill people and supposedly ate their bodies ate their bodies according to what he claimed. Who knows how actually true this was? But Alfred Packer was born Alfred Greiner Packer on January 21st of 1842. He died on April 23rd of 1907, but he was known as the Colorado Cannibal, and he was an American prospector and he self-proclaimed himself as a wilderness guide, which he was not. He was not a wilderness guide at all. And he confessed to cannibalism during the winter of 1874. Though no clear or definitive evidence has been found to this day, and despite in-depth research about proof of his deeds, he is one of only four people, he is one of only four people who has been historically convicted for cannibalism in the United States. The last one being Jeffrey Dahmer. Um, after emerging as the sole survivor, of a six-man party who had attempted to travel through the San Juan Mountains of the Colorado Territory, he eventually confessed to having lived off the flesh of his companions, given more than one version of his account to the circumstances. Um, oh shit, hold on. Um, oh shit, okay. Let me go put that back on there. Somehow it closed out when I shouldn't have. Oh. Mm. So Alfred Packer basically was one of only four people to be but he eventually confessed but he gave more than one different account, more than one version of his account to the circumstances. He kept changing his story. After his story was called into question, Packer would escape jail and he would hide from justice for 9 years. He was eventually found, tried, convicted, and convicted of premeditated murder, and he was sentenced to death. Now, Packer won a retrial and was eventually sentenced to 40 years in prison on 5 counts of voluntary manslaughter. An almost completely fictitious biopic of his exploits, The Legend of Alfred Packer, was released in 1980. And more comedic and heavily fabricated take on the story, titled Cannibal, the musical, was released in 1993. Um, now, Alfred Greiner Packer was born in an unincorporated area of Allegheny County, Pennsylvania, near Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, on January 21st of 1842. He was one of three children born to James Packer and Esther Packer. By the early 1850s, Packer's father had moved his family to LaGrange County, Indiana, where his father worked as a cabinet maker. Packer is said to have had a bitter relationship with both his parents, and in his late teens, Packer would move to Minnesota and he would work as a shoemaker. During the Civil War, Packer joined up and served in the Union Army. Um, During the American Civil War, he enlisted on April 22nd of 1862 in Winona, Minnesota, and he was assigned to Company F of the 16th Infantry Regiment. 8 months later, he was discharged due to epilepsy, which triggered seizures. Technically, that would be an automatic disqualification from the military anyway. On June 25th of 1863, um, so so on June 25th of 1863, Packer enlisted in the 8th Iowa Cavalry Regiment of Iowa, only for his epilepsy to result in a second discharge. Packer would then travel west and worked at odd numerous jobs over the next 9 years. Now, these professions included being a hunter, a wagon teamster, a ranch hand, a field worker, but his seizures and overall attitude ensured that he would never keep a job for very long. But Packer also worked for a couple of months as a guide, but those who knew him, but those yes, um, but Packer also worked for a couple of months as a guide, but those who knew him at this time later stated that he was ill-suited for the role, and he was prone to losing himself in the woods. He ended up working in mining-related jobs, drifting from mine to mine, but he never found prosperity through the industry. But he did work for a short time in the Colorado Territory as a miner, but having no luck, he would end up moving to the Utah Territory. Most people who knew Packer generally disliked him, and they did not trust him, owing to his argumentative personality, his pathological lying, and his reputation for being a thief. Having heard of gold that had been discovered in Breckenridge, Robert McGrew had formed a party of 20 that were ready to join him and make the trip from Salt Lake City to the San Juan Mountains. The stream today is Alfred Packer. Alfred Packer was a cannibal that lived back in the 1800s. Basically, he was a cannibal who admitted to killing people and eating their bodies to hide evidence. So basically, this guy Robert McGrew had formed a party of 20 who were ready to join him and make the trek from Salt Lake City to the San Juan Mountains, south of the Colorado Territory. The men were largely strangers to each other, and they left by November of 1873. One of them, George Tracy, declared that the party encountered a 23-year-old at the time named Alfred Packer near Provo. After they told him that they were headed to the gold country of the San Juan Mountains, Packer said that he would like to join them, claiming he was both a prospector and a guide, and that he knew the San Juan Territory well, which he didn't. As he had no provisions, he did offer $25 to join the group. The prospectors, who needed a guide anyway, accepted Packer's help without question. On the first part of the trip to the San Juan Mountains, members of McGrew's party later said that he had apparently overstated his experience of being familiar to the area, or had even possibly he fabricated his qualifications altogether. He was also reported as being without a rifle at the time the expedition left, having only a Colt revolver with him. Now, throughout the course of their journey, Packer was reported as being greedy with rations, lazy, and obstinate. Basically, he showed no interest in being able to do any work. He apparently was obsessed with how much money the members had brought with them for the journey, and he was reported to have quarreled constantly with party member Frank Miller. At the time of his first trial, Packer was characterized as a whiny fraud by party member Preston Nutter. His epileptic seizures also made his presence in the group apparently strenuous. Moreover, there were rumors about Packer having spent time in jail in Salt Lake City on the charge of having murdered a hunting party. Now, despite the presence of Packer as a guide, the party progressed more slowly than expected towards Breckenridge, and the winter proved to be a major obstacle for them, crippling wagons and horses. While progressing along the Spanish Trail, they encountered heavy snow, which hid the path, forcing the party members to rely almost solely on a compass. Packer's inexperience was also beginning to show itself, and the party ultimately became lost. Provisions quickly ran out, and the men were reduced to surviving first on horse feed, and were nearing the points where they would consider eating the horses themselves. Now, on January 21st of 1874, the party came upon the encampment of Chief Ouray, known as the White Man's Friend, near Montrose, Colorado, set in the Campagna Valley. Though they were desperate, the party still approached the camp with anxiety, unsure of how they would be received by the tribe. However, Chief Ouray supplied them with food and lodging, and recommended they postpone their expedition until spring, since they were likely to encounter a dangerous winter in the mountains. He told them that no Ute Indian would attempt such a journey, and that to chance it would be to risk certain death. Now, Ouray offered offered to allow the men to stay with his tribe until the winter had passed, and he promised to share all that he and his people had with them. Regardless of these warnings, 11 men decided to go on and proceed through the mountains. They intended to travel first to the Los Pinos Indian Agency, which was the closest outpost to that camp, and proceed onward to Breckenridge. Chief Ouray provided them with food for their journey, as well as safe directions to bypass the mountains. Packer, however, was in favor of getting to the agency by going through the mountains, stating that it would be a more direct route, even though it wasn't. The party would cut into two, with 5 men following Oliver Lautensizer along the Gunnison River, and 6 others, among them Packer, heading through the San Juan Mountains. Had Packer wanted to follow the other group, Lautensizer had threatened that he would shoot Packer. Now, on February 9th, Packer and the 5 others in his party left for the Los Pinos Indian Agency 75 miles ahead of where they were at. Now, besides Packer, the group comprised of George Noon, who was a teenager, Israel Swan, an elderly man rumored to be carrying thousands of dollars in cash, which was a lot of money back in that time, James Humphrey, Frank Miller, who was a butcher from Germany, and the red-haired Shannon Wilson Bell. The fact that no one in the other group opposed the departure of their guide has led many researchers to conclude that Packer's inexperience and overall attitude had become quite taxing to them, and that they figured that they were better off without him. The leader of the combined parties, Bob McCrew, guided Packer's men along the river route advised by Chief Ouray until his horses could no longer continue through the water. McGrew unloaded the men's provisions and went back to Ouray's camp. The men continued along the Gunnison River for a time before Packer took his party along a path higher up in the San Juan Mountains. Disregarding Ouray's warning, this decision was made when the men barely had enough food to cover the supposed 14 days it would take to travel the safest route, and they possessed no snowshoes, and they had a bare minimum of matches and no flint, and also had no heavy clothing that would help against the extreme elements of the cold. They went into the mountains with 2 rifles, 1 pistol, a couple of knives, a hatchet, and minimal ammunition. On April 16th of 1874, 65 days after his departure, Packer emerged from the woods alone and made his way across the frozen lake bed to the Los Pinos Indian Agency near Saguache, Colorado. I'm not sure if I said that right. As the men of the agency were eating breakfast, Packer came in and stood before them, begging for food and shelter. He carried with him a rifle, a knife, a steel coffee pot, and a satchel. And the men sat Packer down at the table and gave him some food, which he could not ingest without vomiting. Packer said that his digestion was altered as a result of his prolonged near starvation. Then he related to the men the events that had led him from Ouray's camp to Los Pinos. He said that he had been hired by 5 men to guide them to Breckenridge. He then stated that during their journey he had become snowblind and was left lagging behind the party, becoming a burden for them. Packer claimed that a member of the party, Israel Swan, had supplied him with a rifle just before the others decided to abandon him. Since this moment, he had been forced to survive on his own and make his way out of the mountains with minimal ammunition and virtually no supplies whatsoever. He indicated he had little else to eat than that of roots and rosebuds the entire time that he was alone. He had also eaten his moccasins. The men at the agency listened to his story, but found it rather odd that even though he had been lost in the wilderness for a little over 2 months, he did not look as malnourished and threadbare as most lost wanderers they had come across in the mountains. His face was reported as being bloated, and his overall physique hardly skeletal. Moreover, Packer said he would drink whiskey for breakfast instead of any kind of food. And Packer claimed that he was broke and sold the Winchester rifle he had in his possession to Major Downer, the agency's Justice of the Peace, for $10 at that time, which is equivalent to $300 in today's money. Now, Packer stayed at the agency for 10 days before heading to the nearby town of Saguache, where he began to buy supplies for his journey back home to Pennsylvania. And let me go back up here so you can see a picture of Alfred Packer. Yeah, I'm looking at him. This is a motherfucker I would not want to meet down the dark alley. This is Alfred Packer right here. God, the guy looks fucking creepy. Um, well, when um when Packer reached Sagachi, Packer brought a horse for $70, which is equivalent to $2,000 in today's money, and booked a room at Dolan Salon. Larry Dolan, the owner, later claimed that Packer, which is equivalent to $3,000 in today's money, during his stay, and that Packer even offered to lend him 300. Packer spent an additional $78 in Otto Mears General Store. It was also claimed that he had several different wallets in his possession, which basically he stole them all. He basically after he killed the people. He stayed in Sagachi until Preston Nutter, a member of the original party who remained at Ori's camp, arrived in town with two other original party members. He encountered Packer in Dolan's saloon, and Nutter asked Packer where the rest of the party was. Packer claimed that he got his feet wet and frozen, and he stated that he had set up camp when a winter storm set in, and he started the fire to warm up while the others went ahead to look for food. And Packer claimed that Swan left him with his rifle in case of trouble, and that they never returned. Presuming that they had abandoned him, he had left and made his way through the mountains, feeding mainly on rosebuds and small animals. That's what his claim. Considering that Packer looked rather well fed and that it would be a fatal choice for 5 miners unfamiliar with Colorado to abandon their so-called guide in the middle of snow-bound mountains, Nutter found Packer's story to be odd, and that odd. It was also peculiar that Israel Swan would give Packer his rifle, leaving a group of four people with only one rifle as hunting means. Additionally, he noted that Packer had in his possession a skinning knife that had belonged to Frank Miller. When Nutter asked, Packer claimed that Miller had stuck it in a tree and walked off without it. Doubtful about Packer's story, and convinced that something wrong had happened, Nutter started to fight with Packer. Nutter later said regarding Packer, he was sulky, obstinate, and quarrelsome. He was a petty thief, willing to take things that did not belong to him, whether of any value or not. The two men were separated, and Packer kept on preparing his departure from Sagachi. Now, meanwhile, 2 men of the 5-man party that had taken the Gunnison River route finally arrived at the Los Pinos Indian Agency. They were joined a few days later by the remaining 3 men, including Lawton Sizer. The men were introduced to the head of the agency, General Charles Adams, who had told them he had already met a member of their party by the name of Alfred Packer, and that he spoke of desertion at the hands of his companions. All 5 men at once discredited what Packer had told the general and his staff, stating that the men that they had known would never abandon a man to die. Dalton Sizer told the general that Packer was not to be trusted and expressed suspicion about Packer's story. He noted the Winchester rifle carried in by Packer belonged to an elderly man in Packer's party, and that a pipe he had left behind at the agency belonged to a man named Shannon Bill, who was also a member of that same party. The men convinced General Adams to dispatch a mounted agency officer to Sagachi at once to retrieve Packer for questioning, but under the guise of recruiting him for a search party for the missing men, Packer was in the process of getting his things gathered to leave the area when he was again approached by Nutter and some other men. Now, the agency officer arrived just in time and got between the men. He told Packer he had been sent to enlist him as a guide for the search party for the missing men. Packer was reluctant to go, but with little other options than vigilante justice, he agreed. He mounted his recently purchased horse and followed the officer back to Los Pinos. Now, upon arriving at the agency, Packer met General Adams and 5 men he had not seen since February. The agency officer came in after Packer and relayed to General Adams that a man named Preston Nutter had told him Packer had spent several $100s over his six-week stay in Sagachi, as well as buying a new horse and saddle, and that he was in possession of things that did not belong to him, and that he was penniless when he had originally joined the party. Lawton Sizer demanded an explanation from Packer, who repeated the story exactly as he told it the first time. Packer showed amazement that the men had not been heard from and was concerned for their well-being. At least that's what he was trying to show. When Lawton Sizer asked where his newly acquired wolf came from, Packer stated that he received a cash loan from a man in Sagachi. Adams told Packer that he was sent an officer to Sagachi to verify the story, and the officer returned soon with news from various sources that Packer had been seen with several different wallets and had told varying different stories regarding his journey, and that he had arrived in Sagachi with plenty of cash, and that no one in town claimed to have lent him a penny at all. Adams convened a council of the 5 members. Himself, Packer, and the agency officers, as they were beginning to settle the matter, two Ute Indian tribesmen arrived in Los Pinos, holding strips of dried human flesh which they had found on a hill near the agency while hunting. Packer then begged for mercy, swearing to make a full confession, saying to Adams it would not be the first time that people had been obliged to eat each other when they were hungry, and this sentence opened up what was to become one of several different official statements over the next 20 years. Herman Lauder, the agency clerk, was in attendance and transcribed Packer's first official statement. Packer claimed that the men had left Orway's camp with what they thought was sufficient, which they thought was sufficient food for the anticipated 2-week journey that would lay ahead for them. Sooner than expected, he said provisions were exhausted. They survived for days on roots dug from the ground, pine gum, rosebuds, and the occasional rabbit. After a few days of no wildlife activity due to the extreme cold and eating virtually nothing but roots, he claimed that the men started to eye each other in an unsettling way. A few days after this, he left camp to gather dry firewood and returned to find 4 men around the slain body of Israel Swan, who had been struck in the head with the hatchet and killed instantly. The 4 started to butcher Swan, with Packer accepting the situation and joining them. He claimed several $1,000s was found on Swan's person and divided it up between the men. They consumed the most agreeable parts of Swan's body, packed them up, and moved on with Packer appropriating Swan's rifle. Within 2 days, however, the 5 men were again out of meat, and game continued to elude them. Packer, Bell, Humphrey, and Noon decided in secret that Miller would be the next to go, and Packer confessed that Miller was a stocky man and was chosen for his amount of soft flesh. He was killed with the hatchet blow to the head, and while he was stooping to pick up wood for the fire, and then he was butchered and consumed. Packer took Miller's knife and Miller's share of Swan's money, and it was redistributed among the 4 men, who would then move on to Los Pinos. Now the winter was relentless, and the men were slowly moving, barely able to see in front of them, cursing the wind that was cutting at their exposed skin. Humphrey was next to be sacrificed, followed before too long by George Noon. At last, it was just down to Bell and Packer, and he claimed that the 2 men would swore not to eat each other, and they each had a rifle at this point and a couple of $1,000s of Swan's cash, and presumed that the 2 men would fare well on the remainder of their trip with what minimal game there was to be found. They agreed that they would say that the 4 men had perished from the elements and were buried with dignity, vowing to never speak of the cannibalism. They felt no one would ever believe it was that it was as necessary as they had thought. After trekking for a few days with little else eaten other than a rabbit and some roots, the men were exhausted and set up camp next to a large lake that was skirted on one side by a large grove of hemlock trees. Packer said that a few days after this, Bell snapped out of his blanket and screamed that he could not take it anymore. He told Packer that one of them was going to die for food, and he snatched his rifle and sprinted at Packer with it ready to bash his skull in. Packer deflected the blow and struck Bell in the head with the hatchet, and he claimed that at this point, the only fear he had left was to starve to death. He then butchered Bell, eating as much as he could in preparation for the remaining leg of his journey, and packed a good amount away. He relieved Bell of his share of Swan's money, and then headed on, unsure how far he was from anywhere, or whether he was even going to survive at all. After a while, he mounted a hill and saw at long last the Los Pinos Indian Agency. He threw the remaining strips of Bell's flesh away, presuming that an animal would hastily eat them, and admitted that he did so with a fair degree of hesitation. Okay. Now, General Adams called for a conference among the 5 men and the agency officers to determine the next course of action. It was decided that a search party would be assembled at once to find the men's remains. Um, Of the 5 original party members claimed that they did not believe one single part of Packer's story. General Adams asked of the two Ute Indians if they knew of an area next to a lake that Packer had described, and they said that such a place existed roughly 50 miles away across the hills. The search party was headed by agency clerk Herman Lauder and consisted of the 5 miners from Utah, a few agency officers, and Packer acting as guide. After 2 weeks, as the party was reaching the area of the Lake Fork of the Gunnison River, Packer claimed that he was lost and that he did not recognize the surroundings. Nothing was found, and the party headed back to the agency. Along their route back, Packer attempted to murder Herman Lauder with a knife, and he was caught in the act, restrained, and arrested. General Adams had been willing to believe Packer up to this point, but the unprovoked attempt made on his officer's life convinced him that Packer was a dangerous man. He was transported to Sagachi and jailed by the sheriff outside the town itself for everyone's protection. During Packer's detention, he had retracted what he had said and told the men at the agency about the events leading up to the 5 men losing their lives. He now claimed that the men had encountered a strong blizzard along their way through the mountains. The snow fell so heavily and persistently that they became hopelessly lost and were unable to retrace their steps back to their starting point. Provisions were already minimal when they began the trek and quickly ran out. They just as quickly ran out of matches and were forced to carry hot embers in a steel coffee pot to have a means to light fires. Days went by with no signs of game, and attempts at ice fishing proved utterly futile. After roasting and eating their shoes and attempting to survive on what scant and edible vegetation they could find, the men claimed Packer entered into a pact whereby if one died, his meat would serve to save the others from starvation. After days of hiking with virtually nothing to eat, Israel's Swan could go no further and the others were dangerously fatigued. They found a pine-shaded gulch next to a lake and set up camp. A short time after this, Swan died of a combination of hunger and exposure, according to Packer. Now, Packer signed his first confession. Old Man Swan died first and was eaten by 5 other persons about 10 days out of camp. 4 or 5 days afterwards, Humphreys died and was also eaten. He had about $130. I found the pocket. He found the pocketbook and took the money. Sometime afterwards, while carrying wood, the butcher was killed, as the other two said accidentally that he was also eaten. Bell shot California, which was Humphrey's nickname, with Swan's gun and killed Bell, and I killed Bell and shot him. He basically claims he covered up the remains and took a large piece along, then traveled 14 days into the agency. Bell wanted to kill me with his rifle, but he struck a tree and broke his gun, which I don't think that's even possible. Guns usually jam, they don't really break. And Packer's later amended version of his story. The men had endured almost 20 days from Ori's camp and more than 10 days without any substantial food at all. Packer elaborated that James Humphrey had also died of exposure to the extreme elements, and that George Noom was killed days later by Shannon Bell for the sole purpose of food. After there was no more substantial meat to be had from the 3 fallen men, and then it was just down to Bell and Packer himself. He claimed that he and Bell had agreed that they would stand together until the end, swearing not to eat each other. Days went by, and Bell could no longer take the hunger, and he rushed at Packer with his rifle, intending to bludgeon him with its stock. Packer then shot Bell with his pistol. Packer confessed to taking the valuables of the deceased members, claiming they no longer needed them, but made no statements as to the exact items taken nor to the amounts of money that was accrued from all the men. Now, while he was in jail, observers challenged his credibility and noted that Packer, far from being a victim of cold or starvation, had probably set a trap and led his group in the middle of the hills to kill and rob them anyway because he was a petty thief. Um, um, the following August, on the site of the incident was found by John A. Randolph, an illustrator who worked for Harper's Weekly magazine. He discovered all 5 bodies at the foot of Slumgullen Pass, um, 2 miles southeast of Lake City, Colorado, and a pine-shaded gulch skirted by hemlock trees. They lay above the lake fork of the Gunnison River, now known colloquially as Dead Man's Gulch, which matched the description of where Packer had originally claimed that only Bell was killed. The snow that had been covering the bodies and campsite had melted in the intervening 4 months, and Randolph sketched the scene as he found it and then alerted authorities in nearby Lake City. Now, the story was covered 2 months later on the October 17th issue of Harper's the edition of Harper's Weekly, and included his illustration of the site. And here is Harper's illustration. John A. Randolph of Harper's illustration here of the bodies that were found. Down here is a memorial to Packer's victims at the scene of the crime, which is southeast of Lake City, Colorado. Now, the local coroner and law enforcement set out for the site along with about 20 volunteers, and they discovered the bodies of all 5 men in various states of decomposition, having been left to the elements and animals for 4 months. First responders to the site noted that it appeared that extreme violence had befallen the men. Frank Miller's head was missing entirely from the campsite, which means his head was decapitated. Um, his and Israel Swan's corpse had been considerably worked upon by scavengers, and were little more than scattered bones. Israel's skull had a jagged chunk missing out of it. The bodies of George Noon and James Humphrey were largely flayed torsos of rotting viscera attached to skeletal legs, but with intact and bearded faces. With Humphrey's face being slightly more decayed than Noon's, they had received blows to the head, the shape indicating perhaps a hatchet, and their bodies had noticeable broken bones. Shannon Bell lay with largely skeletal legs, splayed, and arms to his sides that were cruelly cut to their bones, leading to hands that were still fully skinned. His remaining corpse was a mass of viscera encased in an almost woolly flayed torso. His face was still wearing a thick red beard and bushy hair. The lack of noticeable decay in his face suggested that he had been the last to die. The top of Bell's skull had been ripped open. The 3 men whose bodies were still intact, partly intact, had flesh and muscle excised from choice and meaty locations. No attempt had been made to consume bone marrow or any organs at all. Now, the state of the bodies contradicted Packer's version of events. They were all together in one spot, not scattered across miles as he had claimed. Both Humphrey and Noon had large portions of remaining flesh, muscle, and organs that could have been consumed long before Bell attempted to murder Packer, as he had claimed. The men had tattered cloths lashed to their rotting feet, which had replaced the shoes that they had probably eaten, and moldy and tattered blankets lay beneath and beside them. A beaten path went from the resting place of the corpse to a crude shelter that was used by Packer. Moreover, there was evidence to suggest that the deaths had occurred before supplies were totally exhausted. Within the shelter were possessions of the men which Packer had left behind. The theory at the time was that Packer killed the men before supplies ran out to rob them of their possessions, got snowed in, and then he lived in a makeshift shelter for months, wakened to his slain companions and slicing meat off as needed. Preston Nutter accompanied the party to the site and identified the bodies as belonging to the 5 missing men. A rifle broken in two was found close to the bodies, owing to the damage apparent on their remains. It's presumed that it was used to bludgeon one or more of them. The remains were buried at the site by the officials, and the search party returned to Packer's makeshift jail to confront him, only to find him missing. Now, the jail that he had been kept in was a little more than a log cabin located on a ranch property belonging to the Seguelchi County Sheriff. Months had passed with no definitive evidence of a crime having been committed, no bodies discovered, and no formal charges lodged against Packer other than the attempt on Louder's life, which was not tenaciously sought for prosecution and was used more as a means to keep him under custody. Now, Seguelchi County authorities were reportedly not happy about taxpayer dollars being spent so exorbitantly on keeping Packer housed and under constant guard. He was allegedly passed. He was allegedly passed a makeshift key for his irons and given some supplies and easily escaped. Even so, nearly the entirety of Seguelchi was convinced, either through rumor or rational deduction, that Packer was guilty of either robbery and murder. His life was threatened constantly by the nearby townspeople. Packer never divulged who helped him escape, how it was achieved, or why. It was presumed that his guard had been bribed by Packer himself or by someone else. Um, Now, the generally accepted theory of the time was that Packer had attached himself to the party under highly overstated qualifications of being a mountain guide familiar with the area in order to accompany the men to Breckenridge, and at best led his party to miserable deaths due to gross incompetence. This was enough of a crime in itself as far as the local population was concerned. However, and ultimately more popular theory was that he had set out with his party of 5 men from Ori's camp with a premeditated plan to lead them into the wilderness where he would kill and rob them. Nutter and Mountainsizer made it a personal mission to discredit Packer's alleged qualifications for being a guide, let alone a mountain guide at all, and pointed out all his character flaws that they had come to know, stressing his numerous different stories and inconsistencies. Local papers picked up the story, and the incident received constant coverage with highly sensational headlines, many negative comments regarding Packer's character, and highly imagined theories that grabbed both national and international attention. Regardless as to how it may have happened, nearly the entire population of Seguelchi and soon nearly the entire country and beyond found that Packer's culpability for his party's deaths was beyond any doubt. The cannibalism aspect of his charges, although shocking, was not necessarily the foremost issue of his guilt. People at that time were well acquainted with the story of the ill-fated Donner Party, who had resorted to cannibalism during the winter of 1846 and 1847. And I did a video on Donner Party a couple weeks ago, and they were understanding to a degree of the dire need to eat in the unforgiving wilderness. Additionally, cannibalism was and is not illegal per se in the United States unless one commits murder in order to obtain the flesh to be consumed. Even in such a case, the accused would be charged with murder, with the cannibalism itself being charged as the desecration and or abuse of a corpse. Packer would claim for the remainder of his life that he had been unjustly vilified and convicted for engaging in cannibalism rather than for cold-blooded murder, which he continued to deny ever having committed. But in the end, it came down to the question: did the 5 men die due to incompetence or greed? To this day, nobody knows. On March 11th of 1883, Packer was discovered by Jean Cabazon in Cheyenne, Wyoming, living under the alias of John Schwartz, one of the original members of the Utah Mining Party who stayed in Chief Ouré's camp in the winter of 1874. Cabazon was himself a member of the original party of men who left Provo and wisely decided to stay put in Chief Ouré's camp, later safely making his way to their destination with Bob McCrew and Preston Nutter's party. Now, he encountered Packer by chance when Packer approached him looking to buy some supplies. Cabazon reported Packer to the local sheriff, who apprehended him and contacted General Adams. He was summoned to Cheyenne, where he confirmed Packer's identity and accompanied him by train to Denver for his second confession, which Packer signed on March 16. Packer stated that his main reason for fleeing was out of fear of a mob justice being exacted upon him by the populace of Seguelchi. Because the actual crime was committed within the confines of Hinsdale County rather than neighboring Chagouchi County, Packer was accordingly sent to Lake City for detention and prosecution. Instead of claiming that the men were gradually eaten as they died until Bell killed Noon and Packer in turn killed Bell in self-defense, Packer now claimed that Bell had killed the others after Bell had told him to go scouting for any way out of the mountains and to find some food. He had been gone the better part of the day and returned in the late evening. And Packer told General Adams, "I found the red-headed man Bell, who acted crazy in the morning and sitting near the fire roasting a piece of meat which he had cut out of the leg of Miller, and the latter's body was lying the furthest off the fire down the stream." Now, in the ensuing moments of shooting Bell and going after the hatchet, Packer dropped his revolver in the deep snow and subsequently lost it. He claimed that he made himself a shelter out of stray logs to combat the snow and wind, always down from the bodies. Another strong storm set in, and he hunkered down for hours. He was starving and made the decision that he had to eat something or die, and he continued on. Now, Adams asked Packer why he had not told him this story 9 years previous, but Packer replying, "I was excited, I wanted to say something, and the story as I told it came first to my mind." Now, nevertheless, on April 6th, a trial began in Lake City, sorry, spacing out. It was the argument of the prosecution that the only logical reason for Packer to have attempted such a perilous journey through the mountains with such minimal food and supplies was for the sole purpose to lead the men into the wilderness to both kill and rob them. Packer would plead not guilty after 7 days of testimonies and after a week of testimonies and examinations, he was found guilty of premeditated murder of Israel Swan, and sentenced to death by hanging, which was scheduled for May 19th of 1883. It was presumed that Swan's death had occurred on or around March 1st, but it was determined by the prosecution in court that Swan's remains showed signs of a struggle at the time of death and that the others appeared to be killed in their sleep. Among those who testified on behalf of the prosecution were Otto Mears, Larry Dolan, Oliver Lautensizer, and Preston Nutter, who acted as the prosecution's key witnesses. According to a local newspaper, which received their quotes from Larry Dolan, the presiding judge, M.B. Geary, said, stand up, man-eating son of a bitch, and receive your sentence." And then he would face a second sentence. Packer was spared the death penalty when the lawyers discovered that the murder statutes on the books for 1874 had been repealed and replaced with the savings clause, which spared him being tried for murder on a technicality in October of 1885. The sentence was then reversed by the Colorado Supreme Court, being based on an ex post facto law. They had declared that the government could not sentence a man to death for committing a crime if it had indeed occurred before Colorado officially became a state as opposed to a territory. Now, the overturning of his murder charge and scheduled execution did not spare Packer culpability for the men's deaths. However, a second trial was held in Gunnison following a change of venue for his hearing that also granted per the Colorado Supreme Court, as well as having a new judge of Republican Party standing to preside. And pursuant to Packer and his counsel feeling as though the prejudices and the pre-affirmed guilt within the community of Lake City, most of them being Democrats, made it impossible for him to receive a fair and unbiased trial. He again Packer would plead not guilty, but after a swift trial and even speedier verdict deliberation, On June 8th of 1886, Packer was convicted of 5 counts of voluntary manslaughter, and he was sentenced to 40 years in prison, 8 years for each count, which was the maximum sentence allowed per court, per the court and count. And at the time, this was the longest sentence in U.S. history for any person. At the time of his second hearing, local hunters and officials made statements that although the winter of 1874 was one of the worst that they had encountered for quite some time, the area of the San Juan area where Packer and his party were camped was still plenty active with such large wildlife game as deer and antelope, as well as smaller game. There was even a report that the carcass of a deer was found near the campsite. This significantly damaged Packer's claims that the area was so scant with wildlife that the men had to resort to cannibalism quickly. Now, further emphasis was placed on the fact that Packer's choice to hike through the San Juan Mountains during the middle of winter, where snow depths can exceed more than 6 feet in a single downfall, coupled with blistering winds and freezing temperatures, was practically suicidal. Now, he had been given a safe route to follow by locals that was next to a main water source that could have yielded fresh fish, but nothing else, as well as served to keep them on course. But he personally chose a mountain path with minimal supplies, and the naive belief that it would be faster route. In actuality, the route Packer and his companions took was nearly identical in length to the recommended route, though not in traverse, and yet far more dangerous. Now, Packer would take the stand in his own defense. His version of the events that took place at the campsite remained relatively the same as the second official version, but he made a request that he be charged to 40 years, but only for the death of Shannon Bill, who was the only man that Packer continued to claim he had killed, but the other deaths being beyond his control. Now, his request was denied, but he was sent to serve out his sentence at the Cannon and City Penitentiary. Now, when it came to Packer would file appeals on his case on 5 separate occasions, and was roundly denied upon every submission. He sent letters to local newspapers stating he had been unjustly convicted by an unfair and unsympathetic judicial system, and by the ignorant conclusions and judgments of small-minded people. On June 19th of 1899, Packer's sentence was officially upheld by the Colorado Supreme Court. Nevertheless, he was paroled on February 8th of 1901. Following a campaign that was initially spearheaded by an old acquaintance of Packer's named Dwayne Hatch, who had petitioned for his release for nearly a decade before his labors came to the attention of the polypry. I'm not sure what the fuck polypry is, but Packer had served 18 years of his 40-year sentence. An entrepreneurial and resourceful reporter for the Denver Post, Pry saw and appreciated the sensationalism of Packer's case and how his story and pre-existing reputation could generate a buzz. Pry used Packer's service in the Army as a basis to portray him as a common man of the people who got caught in a regrettable situation, a victim of circumstances who did what he had to do to survive, and a man who had essentially been crucified for violating civilized sensibilities by having to resort to cannibalism to survive. Her stories on Packer, Pry's stories on Packer, led to a change of hearts within the local business and businesses and people such that a series of petitions and requests made their way to the office of Colorado Governor Charles Thomas, which were still met with strong opposition. Thomas ultimately relented, and his last official act before leaving office was to parole but not pardon Packer under the agreement that he would not try to profit from his story. After being paroled, Packer went on to work as a guard at the Denver Post, and later as a ranch hand. His employment at the Denver Post came about, and many believe as a direct result of Pry and her employers securing his release. Packer had an endearing respect for Pry for his remaining years, and he referred to her as his liberator. Now, Alfred Packer died on April 23rd of 1907, at the age of 65, and died in Phillipsburg, Colorado, and Jefferson County, Colorado. The cause of his death was cited as dementia, um, although his clinical cause of death has been described as a result of a stroke. Packer is today widely rumored to have become a vegetarian before his death, and was reported by those who knew him as a man rich with stories and was well liked by people. Supposedly, he lived modestly and was reported to be a charitable man. Packer is interred in Littleton, Colorado. His grave is marked with a veteran's tombstone listing his original regiment in 1862, which is a replacement as his original grave marker was stolen. His first name is listed as Alfred. He is known to have gone by both Alfred and Alfred in later life. He was never successful in getting an official state pardoning for his crimes, but the Littleton Cemetery Association cemented over Packer's grave in 1973 to deter grave robbing and vandalism. Now, despite the beliefs that his corpse is intact, claims have been made by Edward Meyer, the vice president of exhibits and archives for the Ripley's Believe It or Not Museum, claimed that they were in possession of Packer's dissected skull, which they bought from an anonymous party for a reported sum of $20,000. No statement was made as to how they verified the authenticity regarding its origin was sufficient. Now, if it's true, if the skull in question does belong to Packer, it is presumed that his head was removed from his body shortly before or after his burial, and was then dissected, with the brain being removed for study, and was then preserved through an arsenic curing process. It is then said to have fallen into the hands of a traveling sideshow, which displayed it until it was later sold to a private party, who in turn later sold it to Ripley's Believe It or Not Museum. As of 2008, the skull is reported to be at the Ripley's Museum in San Antonio, Texas, following its relocation from the New Orleans facility in the wake of Hurricane Katrina hitting. Um, on July 17th of 1989, 115 years after Packer consumed his companions, an exhumation of the five bodies was undertaken by James E. Stars, who was then a professor of law specializing in forensic science at George Washington University. Following an exhaustive search for the precise location of the remains around the area of Cannibal Plateau, the men's remains were located at the end of a residential driveway of a home belonging to a local surgeon, and they were only buried under 13 inches below ground level. Stars and his colleague Walter H. Berkby, concluded regarding the cannibalism. I don't think there will ever be any way to scientifically demonstrate cannibalism, but cannibalism per se is the ingestion of human flesh, which I can never see myself doing, and I don't want to. So you'd have to have a picture of the guy actually eating a person, like actually killing them and eating them. Packer never denied cannibalism, so this was not the main intent of the investigation, but the evidence uncovered was sufficient for Stars to conclude that Packer had indeed murdered his comrades. But Stars came away with the belief that Packer more than likely murdered his companions for their belongings, and he resorted to cannibalism out of necessity rather than intent. Now, the men that Packer killed were reinterred and given a proper burial, complete with funeral rites that being read. And that is the ending of our show for today. Alfred Packer, like I said, he was similar to the Donner Party last week that I talked about. They murdered people to stay alive, and they murdered people and ate bodies to stay alive. Alfred Packer claims the same thing, even though there's no definitive evidence or proof that he did anything in the aspect of eating people to stay alive. So that is the end of our story. Now, for anybody that's still tuned in, I'm going to read off some stuff here that for next week about. I'm going to name up some videos. You tell me what you want me to do. So next week we got Wendigo, Eiffel Tower, Chrysler Building, Times Building, Hell's Kitchen, Manhattan, and then you got Showman's Rest and Barabbas. And then we also got the Pope and Leaning Tower of Pisa. Those are ones I'm going to get to for next week. Next week, let me know what you guys want me to do, and I will get to it as quickly as I can. So let me know. Thanks for tuning in. Make sure to smash that like and subscribe button if you want more videos like this. And like I said, I'll be back next week. I hope you guys enjoyed.